So today we're going to do the recrystallization of an impure acetanilide. The procedure says to use a 250 milliliter Erlenmeyer flask and to weigh about 1 gram. So let's repeat, how do we use an analytical balance? It's always a good idea to never tear the balance. It's always best to do measuring by subtracting. So you see my balance is reading exactly 0 now. So I'm going to weigh the Erlenmeyer flask and write the mass. So for me it's 100.6724 grams. And then we're going to add 1 gram, about 1 gram. What matters is like you weigh about 1 gram, but you need to know the exact amount you put in your flask. So how do we do this? You always grab a tiny amount with the tip of your scapula, and you're going to add at the beginning. So for us, 1 gram would be 101. So my balance must read 101.67. So I'm going to keep adding until I get close to 101. And be very careful here because it's very easy to spill chemicals on the balance. That's why I like to take a small amount and get close to the graduated cylinder. Take a little bit at a time. So I'm on 108 here. I want to get 101.67. Now this is 101.01. So when I'm getting close, I bring my hand and start tapping slowly to get the powder go slowly into the flask. And when I'm there, I stop tapping, and then it will give me the amount I want. So I'm still far. Okay. So now I have 101.6311 gram. So I'm good to go. I'm ready. So now that we have our crystals here, we're going to add water, and we established that the water is the best recrystallization solvent for acetanilide. So the procedure says to add 20 milliliters of DI water. And again, this is not really exact because eventually it will evaporate. So the amount of water is not part of your calculation. So don't waste too much time measuring the exact amount. Okay? I'm going to put some DI water there, and then you let it heat. You heat it on the hot plate. In the meantime, I have here a beaker with DI water that is boiling. So what is the purpose is so that if my crystals don't dissolve in this amount of water, I have to keep adding more and more water until all the crystals dissolve. So that's how recrystallization works. You have to make sure you create a solution, a saturated solution, so you have to heat it up until all your crystals dissolve when it's hot. So what you do is have to put it on the hot plate, keep on swirling a little bit at a time, and you can tell that this acetanilide is pretty dirty. The amount, we were a little conservative about the amount. You really cannot tell how much solvent you should add at the beginning because it all depends on how much impurity. So it's always a good idea to put less solvent and add as you go than put too much and not know how to take it out or wait until you evaporate it. So here 20 milliliters looks like it's a good amount because it's not dissolving when it's cold. So we're heating it and it looks like it's working its way. If it's not enough, I'm going to use the pipette and add 1 milliliter at a time until all the liquid dissolves. Now what can happen there? You might have some solid impurities that are insoluble, and you might have also some impurities that are soluble and they're colored. So it looks like we're going to have probably both because it looks like our liquid is not completely clear. So we have some colored impurities in there. And if we had solid, insoluble impurity, we will still get rid of it because we're going to have to do some filtration. So first step, as the procedure says, you wait until it's completely dissolved. It's hot and it dissolves. And then once it's all in, we'll go to the second. So it's been a few minutes now since we let it, and you can see that the top liquid is colored and it's clear. But if I show you close up, you see there are a lot of impurities there, insoluble impurities. So what do we need to do? We need to get rid of both the insoluble impurities and the coloration. So to take care of the insoluble impurity, we're going to filter it, of course. But the coloration, when you read the handout, it says if your liquid is colored, use some activated charcoal. Now, how much charcoal do we use? We really need to use the bare minimum. The tip of the scapula, something about this much is good enough. We're going to put it there and then swirl a little bit. Allow the charcoal to absorb these impurities. Now, putting too much charcoal will also absorb your substance. So you want to be very careful. You don't want to overdo it because it will absorb your substance. And then what's the next step? We need to get rid of that charcoal and the insoluble impurities. So we need to do a filtration. Now, what type of filtration? We have to do hot filtration. We need to filtrate it while it's still hot. So what does that take? It takes a little bit of you have to work fast and you have to constantly keep adding hot water. So where do we do it? We use this stemless funnel, because if you use a stem, some of the liquid, the crystals will crystallize in the stem and clog it. So you need a stemless glass funnel, and then we're going to put a little bit of a cotton there, so we call it a cotton plug. Now, if you put too much, it will also be stuck, so it will be clogged, and you don't want that. And if you put too little, some of the crystals might go through. So that's really kind of an art, how much is too much. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take some cotton and put it in there and make sure that it's in covering all the sides, and let's hope for the best. So now I'm ready to filter it while it's still hot. So maybe I can run a little hot water to see how it goes with the funnel. You see here, I'm just putting some water, and you see it's kind of going slowly. So it's going to be a slow process. It looks like I put probably too much cotton, because if it's too slow, it's going to be painful. You're going to have a lot of crystals on top, and you have to keep dissolving and dissolving. So it's best to have a decent flow, but not too slow of a flow. So let's try one more time to have another cotton plug in there. And make sure your hands are clean. I'm using gloves, but just put a little hot water. So this time it looks like it's working better. And make sure your funnel is hot. That's the reason I put it here on this beaker with hot water, is to heat it a little bit so the crystals don't crystallize too quickly. Now I'm ready to filter. Now I have to go slowly, add a little bit at a time, and let it filter. I'm going to switch these. Be careful, don't burn yourself. It's best to probably put some mittens to make sure you don't burn yourself. But the rim of a flask is usually, the rim here is usually a little cooler than the flask itself. So we're still doing this hot filtration. As you can see, it's going slowly. But the good news is the liquid in the bottom has absolutely no color. So it shows that we did, the charcoal took care of the colored impurity. And here's one thing, be careful, don't add too much, because again, you don't want to clog the cotton plug. You want to just add a little bit at a time, and you do the filtration. And of course, in the process of going slowly, you will lose some of the solvents. So that's why it's always a good idea to have some hot water on the side to add the lost solvent that is lost by evaporation. So we're going to keep adding, and this is the trickiest part of the whole recrystallization. This is really the hardest one because that's where you're going to lose most of your chemicals if you're not careful. So it's really very, the cotton can be too much and it will crystallize on the surface, or you added too much charcoal and it absorbed some of your substance. So that's why recrystallization is really more an art than a science itself. So it takes some practice to get really good at these things. And of course, you know, if you do it the first time, you might be lucky and it works pretty well, but don't feel bad if it doesn't work very well, because that's really what recrystallization is all about. It's really an art, basically. It really takes a practice to get really good at it. And you can see as I keep filtering, I kept on adding water because I don't want it to run to dryness. And now I'm almost done, so I transferred everything. The last step is to rinse your flask with some hot water. And why? Because we really want to have the maximum recovery here. We want to recover as much as the crystals as we can. And as you can see, every time I add water, it has to be hot and it has to keep on heating, because if it cools off, it will recrystallize. The crystals will recrystallize immediately. So the amount that I'm pouring here is about like less than an inch above the cotton plug. If you put too much again on that funnel, you will have bad results, because a lot of your crystal will crystallize on the top. So far we've been pretty lucky. It worked pretty well. We didn't have any clogging there. And here's my last rinse right there. And of course you're going to have some residue, but it looks pretty good overall. So now, what do we do next? Once we finish that filtration, we're going to rinse one more time the funnel, and then, since we added a lot more water than we needed, we need to evaporate it again. So that's also another aspect of recrystallization that's like an art. You have to let it evaporate, and then the question is, how far should I keep going? And we're going to show you how this should work. So one more rinse, and we're good to go. I'm letting this filtrate completely. I'm done with the hot water. I no longer need it. And now that I finished my filtration, if you remember, we started with 20 milliliter, maybe 30 milliliter, but now we're almost like 40. So what we need to do is heat it to get back to 20 milliliters. So about halfway it has to evaporate. So now that we evaporated half the water, you see the minute I put it on the bench and I swirl a little bit, you start to see some crystals will form, and I can see them right away. So you see it looks milky, it looks slightly milky. So that means you really evaporated all the possible water. So that's definitely a saturated solution. So I'm swirling it a little bit to cool it off. So first you cool it off at room temperature, and then you're going to put it in an ice bath. Now in the meantime, what I did is I prepared my vacuum filtration setup. And you remember we did this before in the extraction. So what you do is you make sure you have your trap attached to the vacuum and then your vacuum flask, and then make sure you have the right filter paper to go there. So this is kind of okay, it's not that hot. I can put in the ice bath and you let it crystallize for whatever time. Normally a slow recrystallization always produces better crystals, so if we could leave it even overnight covered, we come back and it will develop beautiful crystals. But for the sake of the experiment, we need to just do it quickly, so we can just stick it in an ice bath and wait until pretty much you know that it crystallized when all the crystals are together and almost looks like there is no liquid. We're ready for the filtration. Remember to filtrate. You open the vacuum, run some water on your funnel, and you can see that it's secured now. And then you're going to filter your substance. Of course, we put here some ice cold DI water. You see your crystals, just make sure you scrape them and get most of them in your funnel. And the idea is to rinse them with ice cold water. And normally less is more, so meaning like you don't want to use too much water. And you want to make sure you scrape all your crystals and transfer them onto your funnel. Now one thing to remember, that filter paper you should have pre-weighed with the beaker, because at this point we're going to put the substance with the filter paper in a beaker and we're going to let it dry overnight. And then when you come back next time, you just take a melting point and an IR spectrum.